I gripped the steering wheel of my old, beat-up pickup truck so hard my knuckles turned completely white, the faded leather digging into my calloused palms. I had just pulled onto my street after a grueling 12-hour shift, my body aching for a hot shower and a decent meal in the sanctuary of the brand-new home I had literally broken my back to buy. But as I rounded the corner, my stomach violently dropped into my shoes. A massive, heavy-duty commercial moving truck was parked aggressively right across my property line, its diesel engine idling with a low, threatening rumble. And standing right there on my freshly cut front lawn, barking orders at her children like she owned the very dirt beneath her feet, was my sister-in-law, Chloe. My brother, Mason, was hauling a heavy cardboard box out of the back of the truck, laughing with my father, Robert, who was casually directing traffic in my driveway as if he held the deed to my land. I slammed my truck into park right in the middle of the street, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt, Chloe spotted me. Her eyes lit up with a predatory, entitled gleam. She marched right up to my driver's side window, heavily pregnant with her fourth child, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against the glass. I rolled the window down just a crack, the cold evening air rushing into the cab. "You're late, Elijah," Chloe snapped, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary condescension she always used to mask her sheer venom. "Mason and your dad have been doing all the heavy lifting. Mommy said we can take the master bedroom since I need the space for the new baby, so you need to get your junk out of there tonight. You can just sleep in that ugly little camper of yours out in the back." I stared at her, my pulse pounding so hard in my ears it sounded like a bass drum. I looked past her and saw my front door hanging wide open. The brass deadbolt, the one I had just installed a month ago, was completely destroyed. A heavy-duty power drill was sitting casually on my porch chair, a trail of metal shavings sparkling in the porch light. They hadn't just shown up. They had broken into my house. They had drilled out my locks. "Get off my property," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Chloe's fake smile vanished, replaced by an ugly, vicious scowl. "Excuse me? We are moving in. We have a lease. Don't make this difficult, you selfish prick. You don't even have a family. You don't need this house." She reached out and grabbed the handle of my truck door, violently yanking on it, trying to force her way into my cab. When she realized I had hit the lock button, she slammed her open palm against my window. "Let me in. You can't do this to me. I will key the paint right off this piece of trash truck if you don't stop being such a baby and give Mason the keys." I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just pulled out my phone, held it up so she could see the screen, and dialed 911. I locked my eyes with hers as the operator answered. Chloe thought she had me cornered. My parents and my brother thought they had successfully bullied me into submission one last time. They thought the fake lease they had printed off the internet would protect them. But they didn't know that my house was wired with high-definition cameras, capturing every single second of their felony break-in. They had absolutely no idea that in just a few short moments, their sheer arrogance was going to blow up in their faces in the most humiliating, public, and legally devastating way imaginable. Before I tell you about the explosive ending where they lost absolutely everything, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. I read every single one, and it helps me know I'm not alone in dealing with people like this. To truly understand the breathtaking audacity of what was happening in my driveway that evening, you have to understand the 20 years of absolute hell that led up to it. I didn't just wake up one morning and decide to treat my family like strangers. They worked incredibly hard, day in and day out, to earn my absolute disgust. You see, I bought this house with my own money. I didn't have a massive family inheritance waiting for me in a trust fund. I had nothing but my own two hands, a stubborn refusal to quit, and a lifetime of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own home. Growing up, there was a clear, unspoken rule in our household. Mason mattered, and Elijah did not. It wasn't a subtle preference that parents sometimes accidentally show. It was a glaring, undeniable fact of daily survival. Mason was the golden child, the chosen one, the son who could literally do no wrong. If there was a single slice of pizza left in the box, it went to Mason even if I hadn't eaten. If there was extra money for a school field trip, Mason went and I stayed home and mowed the lawn. The disparity only grew wider and more toxic when we reached our teenage years. My parents had actively set up a college fund for Mason, pouring thousands of dollars into an account to secure his future, so he wouldn't have to take out loans. When I asked about my college fund during my senior year of high school, my father, Robert, didn't even look up from his laptop. He just casually mentioned that I was resilient and could figure it out on my own. I remember standing in the kitchen, feeling a hot, stinging sensation behind my eyes, realizing that in their minds, my future simply wasn't worth investing in. I was constantly punished for Mason's mistakes. If he broke a window playing baseball in the yard, I was grounded for 2 weeks for not supervising him properly. If he failed a math test, my mother, Linda, would yell at me for not tutoring him well enough, completely ignoring the fact that Mason spent his evenings playing video games while I worked a part-time job flipping burgers just to buy my own clothes. The breaking point for my childhood happened when I finally got my first real girlfriend. I was 17, hopelessly awkward, and finally happy. Mason, who was only 14 at the time, made it his personal, vindictive mission to destroy the relationship. He flirted with her relentlessly whenever she came over, told her vicious, fabricated lies about me, and intentionally humiliated me in front of her. Eventually, the drama became too much for her, and she broke up with me. I was devastated. I confronted Mason in the hallway, my fists clenched, tears of sheer frustration streaming down my face. My parents heard the shouting and rushed out of their bedroom. Did they discipline Mason? Did they tell him to respect his older brother? No. My mother grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me, telling me to stop being so ridiculously sensitive. She told me to take a joke, and that if a girl could be chased away that easily, she wasn't worth my time anyway. Mason just stood behind her, smirking at me, knowing he had won. Again. The very day I turned 18, I packed my meager belongings into 3 trash bags. I didn't wait for a graduation ceremony. I didn't wait for a tearful goodbye dinner. I just walked out the front door and never looked back. I knew deep in my bones that if I stayed under that roof, I would spend the rest of my natural life living in his shadow, serving as the family scapegoat. I went low contact. I took whatever grueling minimum wage jobs I could find, worked my way through a cheap local community college, and built a quiet, modest life for myself. I rented a nice, 2-bedroom condo with a roommate I met online. For a long time, things were genuinely okay. I kept a massive emotional and physical distance from my family, only seeing them at those mandatory, suffocating holiday gatherings where I would sit quietly in the corner, eat my turkey, and ignore Chloe's passive-aggressive, snide remarks about my lack of a real, high-paying career. I thought I had escaped them. I thought I had finally built a life that they couldn't touch, couldn't manipulate, and couldn't destroy. But I was incredibly naive. I had no idea that the universe was about to throw a massive curveball that would strip away everything I had built, forcing me to crawl back to the very people who had broken me in the first place, only to discover that their cruelty knew absolutely no bounds. The storm was coming, and I was standing right in its path with nowhere to hide. Then came the brutal, unforgiving year of 2020. When the pandemic hit and the world effectively shut down overnight, my fragile independence was shattered. The logistics company I worked for went completely under within the first 2 months of the lockdowns. My roommate, who was a bartender and also lost his entire income, panicked. He broke our lease early, packed his car in the middle of the night, and moved 3 states away to live with his wealthy relatives. Suddenly, I was left standing alone in a 2-bedroom condo with a lease I absolutely could not afford. The government unemployment checks were a drop in the bucket compared to the exorbitant rent and utility bills. I watched my small, hard-earned savings account drain away week by week, dollar by dollar. The anxiety wasn't just in my head. It was a heavy, physical weight pressing down on my chest every single second of the day. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I looked at my banking app, my stomach tied itself into agonizing, nauseating knots. I had to sell everything I owned just to keep the lights on for a few more weeks. I sold my couch, my television, my bed frame, my books, and half my clothes online for pennies on the dollar. I downsized my entire existence into 2 worn-out duffel bags. But I had a desperate last resort plan. I owned a sturdy, reliable pickup truck from the late 90s. It wasn't pretty, the paint was chipping and it guzzled gas, but the engine was bulletproof. I scoured online classifieds and found a guy selling a beat-up, slide-in truck camper for $1,000 cash. I drained the very last cent of my emergency funds, handed over the crumpled bills, and strapped that heavy fiberglass shell to the bed of my truck. The inside was incredibly cramped. It smelled heavily of old canvas and mildew, and the mattress was paper-thin, but it was a solid roof over my head. I swallowed my pride. Felt like swallowing broken glass. I drove that heavy, rattling truck 3 hours down the highway to my parents' house. Mason and Chloe were already living there, taking up 3 of the 4 bedrooms with their growing brood of loud children, living completely rent-free on my parents' dime. I pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under my heavy tires, and knocked on the front door. My mother answered. The polite, forced smile on her face instantly vanished, dropping into a harsh frown the absolute moment she laid eyes on me. I took a deep breath and explained my desperate situation. I told them I had lost my job, lost my home, and had nowhere else to go. I didn't ask for a room inside the house. I didn't ask them to feed me or pay my bills. I just pleaded for a safe place to park my camper for a few months until the world opened back up and I could secure a new salary. I just wanted to park on the unused, weed-choked patch of gravel next to their detached garage, so I wouldn't have to risk sleeping in dangerous, unlit retail parking lots where I could be robbed or worse. My father, Robert, stepped up behind my mother. He looked at me, his eyes cold and analyzing, then looked past my shoulder at the ugly, rusted camper sitting in his pristine, perfectly manicured driveway. He slowly crossed his arms over his chest. "We don't have the space, Elijah," he said. His voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of any warmth, empathy, or paternal concern. It was the tone you use to dismiss a persistent door-to-door salesman. "Dad, please," I begged, hating how my voice cracked. "It's just the gravel patch. I won't even come inside the main house. I won't use your water or your electricity. I just need a safe place to close my eyes at night without constantly looking over my shoulder." "It's an absolute eyesore," my mother chimed in, visibly wrinkling her nose in disgust. "What on earth will the neighbors think? Having our oldest son living like a dirty vagrant out in the yard? It's embarrassing, Elijah." Then the front door swung wider, and Mason and Chloe walked out onto the porch. Chloe took one look at my battered truck and burst into a loud, shrill fit of laughter. She actually pointed her perfectly manicured, diamond-ringed finger right at my face. "Oh my God! Look at him!" she giggled, leaning her head onto Mason's shoulder. "He actually lives in that tiny little box. You look like a literal homeless bum, Elijah. I guess you really are the failure of the family." Mason smirked, wrapping a protective, arrogant arm around his wife's waist. "Told you he'd end up in the gutter," he muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. I stood there frozen, the cold afternoon wind biting through my thin denim jacket, staring at the people who were supposed to be my flesh and blood. They were actively, gleefully enjoying my misery. They were feeding off my rock-bottom moment. Finally, my father sighed and offered a compromise. He told me with a straight face that I could park the camper on the gravel patch, but I would have to pay him exactly $1,000 a month in rent. $1,000. That was the exact price of a decent, luxury apartment in my old area. He knew I was unemployed. He knew my bank account was at absolute zero. It wasn't an offer. It was a deliberate, calculated, and incredibly cruel insult designed to make me leave. I didn't argue. I didn't scream or beg. My vision blurred slightly with unshed tears, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I turned around, walked slowly back to my truck, climbed into the freezing cab, turned the ignition, and drove away, leaving my family in the rearview mirror. For the next 2 grueling years, I lived an invisible, nomadic, and terrifying life. I parked in the darkest corners of industrial lots, constantly terrified of a police officer's flashlight tapping on my window in the dead of night, forcing me to move. I learned how to survive on the extreme margins of society. I sneaked a heavy-duty extension cord into the exterior outlets of random, closed commercial buildings just to keep my small camper refrigerator cold enough so my cheap groceries wouldn't spoil and give me food poisoning. I showered at a cheap, 24-hour budget gym, keeping my head down and avoiding eye contact with anyone. In the dead of winter, the camper was a literal icebox. I would sleep fully clothed in a heavy winter coat, a beanie pulled over my ears, shivering violently under 3 layers of cheap blankets, praying my tiny, overworked electric heater wouldn't trip the camper's main breaker and leave me to freeze. In the sweltering heat of summer, it was a suffocating, unbearable oven. The heat would radiate intensely through the thin fiberglass walls, leaving me drenched in a pool of my own sweat, gasping for fresh air in the stagnant heat. But I did not break. I survived. Eventually, the world started to slowly turn again, and I found a grueling, back-breaking job working the loading docks in the warehouse of a local logistics company. The owner, Mr. Wyatt, was a tough, no-nonsense, calloused man who deeply respected hard work over fancy degrees. When he inevitably found out I was living in my truck, because I was always the first one to arrive and the last one to leave, he didn't judge me or look down on me. He handed me a key to the back gate and told me I could park the camper in the very back of the secured employee lot, behind the shipping containers. He even let me use a dedicated power outlet and a water spigot. In exchange for his incredible kindness, I worked like an absolute dog. I took every single grueling shift available. I worked weekends, holidays, and exhausting overnights. I became good friends with the night security guard, a great, quiet guy named Carter, who bent the rules and let me use the indoor warehouse bathrooms so I wouldn't have to deal with the nasty, degrading chore of emptying the portable chemical toilet in the camper. I kept my head down, kept my mouth shut, and learned every single aspect of that business. My dedication paid off. Within a year, Mr. Wyatt gave me a massive promotion to a supervisory role, managing the entire warehouse floor. It came with a substantial salary increase, full benefits, and actual stability. But the fear of the streets never left me. I lived on cheap instant noodles, wore my work boots until the soles fell off, and saved every single dime I made. I watched my bank account grow. Slowly, steadily, the numbers climbed. I was terrified of ever being homeless again, so I hoarded my cash like a madman preparing for the apocalypse. After 2 brutal, exhausting years of living in a cramped fiberglass box, I finally had enough cash saved up for a massive down payment. I searched the market aggressively and found a great, unbelievable deal on a beautiful 3-bedroom manufactured home just 2 miles from the warehouse. I sat in a pristine office, my hands shaking slightly, and signed the thick stack of mortgage papers. I got the keys. The day I drove my loud, rattling truck onto my very own paved driveway, I backed the camper deep into the fenced-in backyard and unhitched it. I set it up on cinder blocks as a permanent monument, a daily reminder of exactly what I had survived and exactly who had abandoned me. I walked into my empty, echoing house, laid down flat on the plush carpet in the center of the living room, stared up at the pristine white ceiling, and for the first time in years, I wept. They were ugly, heaving sobs of absolute relief. I was safe. I was finally safe. But the peace wouldn't last. The storm I thought I had outrun was about to find my new address. My biggest, most catastrophic mistake was letting my guard down for just a few days. I was so incredibly proud of what I had achieved, so desperate to prove to the universe that I wasn't the failure my family claimed I was, that I took a few photos of the house. I took pictures of the spacious living room with its fresh coat of paint, the modern kitchen with its stainless steel appliances, and the wide, welcoming front porch. I posted them on my social media pages. I didn't include the address, of course. I just wanted the world, and maybe subconsciously my family, to know that I had clawed my way out of the dirt and built a real life. A few weeks later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon while I was organizing my new garage, my doorbell rang. I wiped the grease off my hands with a rag and walked to the front door, expecting a package delivery. I swung the door open and found myself face to face with my absolute worst nightmare. My entire estranged family, Robert, Linda, Mason, Chloe, and their 3 loud, unruly kids were standing on my front porch. No warning text. No phone call asking if they could visit. They had completely bypassed basic human decency and boundaries. To this day, I have absolutely no idea how they found my physical address. My best guess is that Chloe, who had entirely too much free time, stalked my workplace and followed me home one evening. Before my shocked brain could even process what was happening or tell them to leave, they pushed right past me. They literally shoved their way through my front entryway like a herd of entitled tourists and immediately started wandering around my private sanctuary. Chloe's eyes darted everywhere, greedily taking in the generous square footage, the expensive new appliances I had saved for, and the large, fully fenced-in backyard visible through the sliding glass doors. She wore this incredibly creepy, calculating smirk that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. It wasn't the look of a proud sister-in-law. It was the look of a vulture circling a fresh carcass. My mother, Linda, walked critically through the hallways, running her hands along the newly painted walls, her nose wrinkled in that familiar, judgmental way. "This is an awful lot of space for just one person," my mother said, her voice echoing loudly in the hallway, intentionally making sure I heard her. "You don't have a wife. You don't have any children. What on earth do you possibly need 3 large bedrooms for, Elijah? It seems excessively wasteful." "Yeah," Mason chimed in, leaning heavily against my pristine kitchen island, completely uninvited. "It's actually way closer to my job than Mom and Dad's house. The commute from here would be a breeze. 10 minutes tops." Red flags didn't just wave in my mind. They violently whipped and snapped in a hurricane-force wind. The sheer audacity of these people, walking into the home of the son they had abandoned to the streets, analyzing the property like greedy real estate prospectors, made my blood boil. Eventually, Mason cleared his throat loudly. He snapped his fingers, a sharp, authoritative sound. Instantly, like a well-rehearsed military drill, my parents and Chloe gathered the chaotic kids and walked out onto the front porch, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind them. Mason and I were left completely alone in the center of my living room. He crossed his arms over his chest, adopting the arrogant, puffed-up posture of a corporate CEO preparing to deliver a non-negotiable mandate to a lowly employee. "Listen, Elijah," Mason started, his tone dripping with heavy condescension. "You've got a really nice place here. I'm surprised you pulled it off. But let's be real for a second. You absolutely do not need all this room. Chloe is pregnant with kid number 4. The house is getting way too cramped at Mom and Dad's place. The kids are practically sleeping on top of each other, and it's stressing her out." I stared at him, my jaw tight. "And what exactly does your wife's stress have to do with me and my house?" Mason sighed heavily, rolling his eyes as if I were a slow child failing to grasp a painfully simple concept. "I'm taking the house, Elijah. We're going to move the family in here by the end of the month. It just makes the most logical sense for everyone. You've still got that old camper set up in the backyard, right? You're used to living out there. You like it rough. You can just stay out in the camper, and we'll take over the main house. We'll set some strict ground rules, obviously. You can't just be walking into our space whenever you want to use the kitchen. We'll need our privacy. But it's a good setup for the family." The sheer, breathtaking entitlement of his words slammed into my chest like a physical blow. The room actually spun for a fraction of a second. He wasn't asking to rent a spare room. He wasn't offering to buy the house from me at market value. He was flat out demanding that I hand over the keys to my property, move back into the freezing, miserable camper I had just spent 2 agonizing years trying to escape, and let his family live in luxury in my home. And the absolute worst part? He didn't offer a single red cent for rent or to help cover the mortgage. He fully expected me to continue paying the bank every month while he and his wife lived the high life for free. "Are you completely out of your mind?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet, vibrating with barely contained rage. Mason frowned, clearly deeply annoyed that I wasn't immediately bowing to his ridiculous demands. Look, don't be a selfish jerk. Family comes first. You don't have anyone to care for. I have a pregnant wife and kids to support. You owe us this much. You're my older brother. Step up and act like a man. I don't owe you a damn thing, I roared. The sudden volume of my own voice startled even me. I rarely raised my voice. The last time I had shouted at Mason, my father had taken off his leather belt. But this wasn't their house. This wasn't their domain. This was my sanctuary, built on my suffering. I bought this house. I worked 70 grueling hours a week, sweating in a warehouse, while you sat on your ass letting mommy and daddy pay your credit card bills. You want a house? Get your lazy, entitled wife to get a job and buy your own. Mason's face instantly turned bright, violent red. The veins in his neck bulged. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us until we were standing chest to chest. You don't deserve this place. He spat, small flecks of saliva hitting my cheek. You're a loser, Elijah. You've always been a miserable loser. Give me the damn keys right now. I didn't cower. I didn't step back. Instead, I laughed. A loud, sharp, manic laugh that completely threw him off balance. I reached into my jeans pocket, pulled out my smartphone, opened the camera app, and hit record. I held the lens right up to his furious face. Say that again, Mason. Tell the camera exactly how you're trying to steal my house and force me outside. Right on cue, hearing the commotion, the front door burst open. My parents and Chloe charged back inside, their faces masks of outrage. They immediately surrounded me like a pack of rabid wolves. Elijah, stop this childish nonsense right now, my mother shrieked, her hands grasping aggressively at my arm, trying to pull the phone down. Just do it for Mason. He needs the space for the babies. Why are you always being so difficult and stubborn? Because it is my house, I yelled, stepping backward to ensure I kept all of them in the frame of the recording video. Get out, all of you. Get out of my home before I call the cops and have you dragged out in handcuffs. Chloe violently shoved her way to the front of the group. Her face was twisted in an incredibly ugly, vicious sneer, her eyes wide and unhinged. You selfish, pathetic prick. I am pregnant. You cannot do this to me. I deserve a real, beautiful home for my babies. You owe me. You deserve exactly what you work for, Chloe, which is absolutely nothing. I shot back, the years of suppressed anger pouring out of me. You're a stuck-up, lazy leech who has never respected me a single day in your miserable life. I wouldn't let you live in my house if you were the last people left on planet Earth. That completely broke her fragile ego. Chloe let out a scream, a high-pitched, guttural sound of pure fury, and physically launched herself at me. Her arm swung through the air with surprising speed, and her heavy, diamond-encrusted rings connected hard with my left cheekbone. The sharp, blinding sting of pain exploded across my face. She kept coming, clawing frantically at me, trying to scratch my eyes out with her long acrylic nails. Mason grabbed her around the waist from behind, pulling her back while she kicked and thrashed wildly, screaming vile obscenities at the top of her lungs. I have every second of that on video, I shouted over her deafening screams, holding the phone high in the air so they could see the red recording. That is assault and battery. Get the hell out of my house right this second, or I am pressing criminal charges against her. My father grabbed my mother's arm, his face pale. He looked at the phone, then looked at my bleeding cheek. He realized instantly that I was not bluffing. Let's go, he muttered urgently, pushing Mason toward the door. They dragged a kicking, screaming Chloe out the door. My mother lingered on the porch for one final second, fake tears streaming down her face. She looked at me with cold, dead, calculating eyes. You have exactly 1 week to come to your senses, Elijah. 1 week to do the right thing, or you will deeply regret this. I slammed the heavy door right in her face and aggressively threw the deadbolt, the loud click echoing in the sudden silence of the house. My chest was heaving, drawing in ragged breaths. My cheek throbbed fiercely where Chloe had struck me, a warm trickle of blood running down to my jaw. But as I leaned against the door, I didn't feel an ounce of fear. I felt a cold, icy, resolute calm settling deep over my mind. The skirmish was over, but the absolute war for my survival had officially started. The very second I heard their car engines rev and their tires screech out of my driveway, I didn't collapse on the couch. I didn't go to the bathroom to inspect the bleeding scratch on my cheek. I walked straight to my kitchen island, flipped open my laptop, and went to war. I knew exactly how my family operated. They were masters of manipulation. By the time they drove the 3 grueling hours back to their hometown, my mother and Chloe would have a fully fabricated, emotionally manipulative story ready to deploy to the rest of the family. They would paint me as a deranged, violent, unstable monster who randomly attacked a pregnant woman and heartlessly kicked his loving, supportive family out into the cold streets. I absolutely refused to let them control the narrative this time. I had been the silent victim for too long. I opened Facebook. My fingers flew across the keyboard, trembling slightly with leftover adrenaline. I typed out a massive, detailed post. I explained exactly what happened, leaving out no humiliating detail. I described how they showed up completely uninvited, how Mason demanded I move out of my own home and back into the freezing camper, how they refused to offer a single penny for rent, and exactly how Chloe had physically assaulted me when I dared to say no. To seal the coffin, I took a screenshot directly from the video I had recorded. A perfectly clear, high-definition, blurry motion frame of Chloe's hand mere inches from my face, her expression contorted in pure, demonic rage. I attached the photo, tagged every single aunt, uncle, and cousin I could think of in the extended family network, and hit publish. Then, immediately, I set my profile to ultra-private. The fallout was instantaneous and explosive. My phone started vibrating off the kitchen counter like a jackhammer. Notifications poured in by the dozens. Aunts, uncles, and older cousins who had quietly watched my parents blatantly favor Mason for over 2 decades were finally seeing the undeniable, photographic proof of their extreme toxicity. My preemptive strike worked perfectly. By the time my parents and Mason tried to spin their web of desperate lies that evening, the entire extended family had already seen the ugly truth. The court of public opinion had convened, ruled swiftly, and my parents were found overwhelmingly guilty. But not everyone was immediately on my side. My mother's enablers, her little group of flying monkeys, started to attack. Later that night, I received a furious, unhinged phone call from a blocked number. A man's voice, thick with misplaced righteous anger, screamed into my ear, calling me a horrible, greedy brother. He demanded I step aside and make way for a real family man like Mason, claiming I was hoarding wealth while children suffered. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my honor or explain my trauma. I simply took a deep breath, said, "You have the wrong number," hung up, and blocked him. I wasn't going to waste a single breath arguing with fools who refused to see the truth. The rest of the week passed in a state of exhausting, high-alert paranoia. Every single time a car drove past my house a little too slowly, my muscles instantly tensed. Every time a shadow moved across the blinds, my heart rate spiked. I knew my mother's 1-week ultimatum wasn't just an empty, dramatic threat. They were coming back. They were far too entitled, too arrogant, and too deeply accustomed to completely breaking my boundaries to simply give up after one failed attempt. They honestly believed the house belonged to them by divine right. I spent that entire week physically and legally preparing my fortress. I drove to a heavy-duty hardware store and bought the thickest, most robust security chains they sold for both the front and back doors. I spent a small fortune on a top-of-the-line, 4-camera high-definition security system, including a smart doorbell camera that recorded crystal-clear audio and video straight to a secure cloud server the moment it detected motion. I spent my evenings up on a ladder, drilling mounts directly into the siding of my house, running wires through the attic, and meticulously testing the camera angles on my phone. I made absolutely sure there were 0 blind spots in the driveway, the front porch, or the deep backyard where the camper sat. I was turning my home into an impenetrable bunker. Exactly 7 days later, right on schedule, the new doorbell chime echoed loudly through my house. I didn't walk to the window. I simply pulled out my smartphone and checked the live camera feed. Standing on my front porch were my mother, my father, and Mason. Mason looked incredibly impatient, shifting his weight aggressively from foot to foot, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. My father looked furious, his jaw clenched tight. My mother, however, was putting on an absolute masterclass in manipulation. She was holding a small, plastic Tupperware container of baked goods, trying to look domestic, sweet, and entirely harmless. I walked quietly to the front door. I did not unlock the heavy brass deadbolt. I simply leaned close to the wood and spoke loudly enough for them to hear. "Go away." Instantly, the facade dropped. They started pounding on the door. Heavy, aggressive fists slamming against the fiberglass, shaking the door in its frame. "Elijah, open this door right now," my father bellowed. His deep voice used to strike absolute terror into my heart when I was a helpless kid. It used to make me freeze in fear. Now, standing in a house I owned, it just sounded incredibly pathetic and desperate. I unlocked the deadbolt but kept the heavy, steel security chain firmly fastened. I opened the door just a crack, a mere 3 inches of space. The absolute moment the door moved, Mason and my father violently shoved their combined body weight against the heavy wood, trying to force it open and barge inside. The thick metal security chain pulled painfully taut, groaning loudly under the immense pressure, but the heavy-duty screws I had installed held firm. I braced my heavy work boots against the floorboards, dropped my shoulder, and pushed back with all my strength, trapping them in the doorway. "Stop it right now," I shouted, my voice cutting through their grunts of effort. "Look up. I have cameras recording every single second of this. If you don't step back off my porch, I am calling the cops for attempted home invasion." My mother gasped loudly and frantically pulled my father back by his jacket sleeve. Mason stumbled backward, suddenly glaring up at the sleek, black doorbell camera, as if he had just noticed it was recording his every move. Seeing that physical force had failed, my mother instantly switched tactics. The aggressive anger vanished entirely, replaced by a sickeningly sweet, trembling, tearful voice. She put on the crocodile tears, her lower lip literally quivering. "Elijah, honey, please," she cried softly. "Are you ready to let Mason move in yet? We brought you some of your favorite cookies. Let's just sit down inside and talk about this like a real family. You know he needs the house more than you do. Be reasonable, sweetheart." I looked at her through the narrow crack in the door. I looked deep into the eyes of the woman who had watched me drive away in a freezing, $1,000 camper, completely homeless and terrified, and had done absolutely nothing to help me when I needed her most. "You are a terrible, toxic mother," I said, my voice ice-cold and incredibly steady. "And he is a terrible, selfish brother. I don't love him. I don't love you. You treated me like garbage my entire life while you worshipped him. Now, get off my porch, or the police will remove you in handcuffs." My mother let out a loud, theatrical, wailing sob. She covered her face with her hands, leaning heavily against my father for dramatic effect. My father sneered at me, a look of pure, unadulterated disgust twisting his features. "You'll regret this, boy," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at the gap in the door. "You're dead to us." They turned around and walked briskly back to their cars. I locked the deadbolt and watched them drive away on the live camera feed, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I watched their taillights disappear down the street, a cold dread washed over me. It was far too easy. They gave up much too quickly. My stomach churned with a deep, unsettling intuition. This wasn't a victory. This wasn't the end of the war. This was just a tactical retreat. They were planning something much, much worse. They thought I was playing a childish game, and they were absolutely determined to win at all costs. I didn't know exactly what their next move was going to be, but as I checked the locks on my windows, I knew I had to be ready for an absolute nightmare. I drove home from the warehouse that Friday evening with a strange, heavy knot sitting in the pit of my stomach. My shift had been long. My boots felt like they were filled with lead, and all I wanted was to sit on my new couch and stare at a blank television screen. I turned the corner onto my quiet suburban street, the headlights of my old truck cutting through the fading evening light. And there it was. A massive, yellow commercial moving truck was backed squarely into my driveway, its tires crushing the edge of my freshly planted flower beds. Next to it was Mason's silver minivan. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it physically hurt. I hit the brakes, throwing my truck into park right in the middle of the street. I didn't even bother turning off the ignition. I jumped out of the cab and sprinted toward my house. Mason and his kids were hauling heavy cardboard boxes up the steps of my front porch. Chloe was standing by the front door, barking orders, holding a clipboard like she was managing a construction site. "Hey!" I roared, my voice tearing through the quiet neighborhood. Mason froze, dropping a box of kitchen supplies onto the concrete. Chloe whipped her head around. When she saw me, she didn't look scared or embarrassed. She actually smiled. It was a terrifying, victorious smirk. "Elijah," she called out, waving her hand dismissively. "You're home early. We're just moving the big stuff into the master bedroom. Mommy said we can take the house, so you need to get your junk out of the closets tonight. You can just sleep in that ugly little camper of yours out in the back. Mason will help you carry your clothes out there." I didn't look at her. I looked past her shoulder. My front door, the solid oak door I had just polished 2 days ago, was hanging wide open. The shiny new brass deadbolt I had installed was completely ruined. A heavy-duty power drill was sitting casually on my porch chair, a trail of twisted metal shavings scattered across the welcome mat. They hadn't just shown up. They had literally broken into my home. They had drilled out my locks like common criminals. "Get off my property," I said. My voice was no longer a shout. It was a low, dangerous whisper that vibrated with pure rage. Chloe's fake smile vanished. "Excuse me? We are moving in. We have a legal lease. Don't make this difficult, you selfish prick. You don't even have a family. You don't need this house." She marched down the steps, getting right in my face. "Let us in. You can't do this to me. I will key the paint right off your piece of trash truck if you don't stop being such a baby and give Mason the keys." I didn't argue. I didn't scream back. I just pulled out my phone, held it up so she could see the screen, and dialed 911. When Chloe realized what I was doing, she lunged at me, trying to snatch the phone from my hand. I stepped back, keeping her at arm's length. I gave the emergency operator my exact address and reported a home invasion in progress. Within 5 minutes, the wail of police sirens pierced the air. 2 black and white cruisers came speeding down the street, their lights flashing blue and red against the houses. 4 officers stepped out, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. "What's going on here?" the lead officer asked, looking at the moving truck, then at me, and then at Chloe, who had suddenly transformed her face into a mask of pure, innocent terror. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Chloe cried, clutching her pregnant belly dramatically. "This man is trying to kick us out of our home. We just signed the lease, and he's going crazy." Right on cue, my parents' sedan pulled up to the curb. Robert and Linda practically fell out of the car, rushing over to join the circus. My mother immediately started nodding along with Chloe. "It's true, officer." My mother lied smoothly, not even making eye contact with me. "My son Elijah agreed to rent this house to his brother. They have all the paperwork right here." Mason scrambled into the cab of the moving truck and emerged holding a manila folder. He handed a single sheet of paper to the officer. "Here's the lease agreement," Mason said confidently. "Signed and dated." The officer looked at the paper. Then he looked at me. "Sir, did you sign this document agreeing to rent this property?" I took a deep breath. I let the silence hang for just a second. I looked at Mason's smug face. I looked at my mother's fake tears. I looked at Chloe's arrogant posture. They honestly thought they had won. They thought this forged piece of paper would force the police to walk away and label it a civil dispute. "Officer," I said calmly, pulling my brand new driver's license from my wallet. I handed it over. "That is my legal address. I am the sole owner of this property. I bought it with my salary, not a penny from anyone else. And that signature on that fake lease is a complete forgery. They don't even know what my handwriting looks like." The officer frowned, comparing the signature on my license to the chicken scratch on the paper. It wasn't even close. The lease signature was written in bubbly cursive. My real signature is a sharp, jagged scrawl. "Furthermore," I continued, pointing a stiff finger directly at my front porch, "if you look right there on that chair, you will see a power drill and metal shavings. They drilled out my deadbolt to gain entry. That is breaking and entering." Mason's face lost all its color. He suddenly looked like a terrified little boy. "And the best part?" I said, raising my voice so my entire family could hear every single word. I turned and pointed to the sleek, black doorbell camera mounted next to the door, and then to the 3 other high-definition security cameras tucked under the eaves of the roof. "Every single second of this is recorded. I have high-definition video of Mason drilling the lock. I have video of Chloe threatening to destroy my vehicle. And I have cloud-backed footage from last week of Chloe physically assaulting me on that exact porch." The absolute, deafening silence that fell over my driveway was the sweetest sound I have ever heard in my life. Chloe's jaw actually dropped open. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a strangled gasp. My father took a massive step backward, suddenly trying to distance himself from the moving truck. "Those are felonies," I said, staring dead into Mason's panicked eyes. "Breaking and entering, forgery, fraud, assault. I have the evidence to send you and your wife to prison, Mason, which means you lose your job. You lose your income. You lose everything." The lead officer looked at the cameras, looked at the drill, and then glared at Mason. "Sir," the officer said sharply, "is this your drill?" Mason couldn't even speak. He just nodded dumbly. "I am giving you exactly one chance," I told them, my voice echoing in the quiet street. "I am doing this solely for the sake of your children, who do not deserve to watch their parents get handcuffed today. You have exactly 10 minutes to get every single box out of my house. Get in your cars and never, ever come back. If you are not gone in 10 minutes, I am pressing full criminal charges, and I am calling Child Protective Services." Chloe snapped. She fell to her knees right there on the concrete driveway and started screaming. She grabbed the forged lease agreement from the officer's hand and frantically tore it into tiny pieces, tossing them into the air like confetti. "Pick that up," the officer snapped, pointing at the shredded paper on the ground. "Or I'm citing you for littering on top of everything else." Watching them pack their moving truck in complete and utter silence was a defining moment in my life. Mason was sweating profusely, his hands shaking as he carried the heavy boxes back down the porch steps. Chloe was sitting on the bumper of the minivan, openly weeping, furiously scrubbing her face with her hands. My parents stood on the sidewalk, looking completely humiliated, avoiding the stern, judgmental glares of the 4 police officers who had crossed their arms and decided to stay and watch the entire eviction process. Before my mother could get into her car to leave, she turned to me. She looked broken, but there was still a desperate, manipulative gleam in her eye. She actually reached out to touch my arm. "Elijah, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We can fix this. Mason can pay you rent. We can set up a payment plan. You don't have to throw your family away like this." I yanked my arm back as if she had burned me with a hot iron. "Throw my family away?" I asked loudly, making sure the officers heard me. "Where was this family when I lost my job and my condo? Where were you when I begged you for a piece of gravel to park my camper on so I wouldn't get mugged in the middle of the night? You laughed at me. You demanded $1,000 a month for dirt. You told me I was an eyesore." My father looked down at his shoes, his face turning a deep, shameful shade of crimson. "You let Mason and Chloe treat me like garbage my entire life?" I continued, letting 20 years of venom pour out of my chest. You spent your entire college fund on him, and you gave me nothing. You watched me freeze in that camper for 2 years. And the very second I secure a good salary and buy a home with my own blood and sweat, you try to break in and steal it for your golden child? You are horrible people. I owe you nothing. Get out of my sight. My mother buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. My father didn't say a single word. He just opened the car door for her, got into the driver's seat, and drove away without looking back. Mason threw the last box into the truck, slammed the heavy metal door shut, and drove off, leaving me standing alone in my driveway with 4 cops and a broken front door. I spent the rest of the evening installing a brand new, reinforced steel lock. I slept better that night than I had in years. Things went completely quiet for several months. I focused on my job, earned another promotion, and actually started to enjoy my life. I invited 2 of my closest friends, Matthew and Ryan, to rent out the 2 spare bedrooms. They were great guys, respectful and clean, and their rent money completely covered my mortgage, allowing me to funnel my entire salary straight into my savings account. When December rolled around, I decided to host a massive Christmas Eve party at my house. I invited aunts, uncles, cousins, and my grandparents. Given the explosive Facebook post from months prior, the family was entirely on my side. Nearly 40 people showed up. The house smelled like roasted turkey, fresh pine, and cinnamon. We were playing music, laughing, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I actually belonged to a family. About 2 hours into the party, the front door opened. The music stopped. The laughter died instantly in the crowded living room. Standing in the entryway, brushing snow off their coats and holding cheap, hastily wrapped presents, were my parents, Mason and Chloe. They tried to plaster on fake, cheerful smiles, pretending that the felony break-in from the summer had simply never happened. They actually thought they could just crash my party, hand me a cheap gift, and force their way back into my life through sheer stubbornness. Before I could even take a step forward, Uncle David, my mother's older brother, stood up from his armchair. He is a tall, intimidating man with a booming voice. "What in God's name are you doing here?" Uncle David demanded, pointing a thick finger right at my mother. My mother flinched. "David, please. It's Christmas. We just want to see Elijah. We brought gifts." "You don't deserve to be in this house," Uncle David roared. The entire room fell dead silent. "After the stunt you pulled? Trying to steal this boy's house for your spoiled brat of a son? You should be ashamed to show your faces in public, Linda." My grandparents, who were sitting on the couch, slowly stood up. My grandfather, a man of very few words, looked at my father with a level of deep, profound disappointment that I had never seen before. "You failed as a father, Robert," my grandfather said quietly. "You coddled Mason until he became a thief, and you abandoned Elijah. We have never been more ashamed of you. Get out of his house." Chloe immediately reverted to her default setting. Victimhood. She dropped her cheap gift on the floor, dramatically slumped against the wall, and started sobbing loudly. "It's not fair," she wailed, clutching her chest. "I have 4 babies. We are living in a tiny bedroom. Elijah has all this space and all this money, and he won't share the wealth. He's punishing my children." I stepped out from the crowd and looked her dead in the eye. "You are punishing your own children, Chloe," I said firmly. "You have a college degree, yet you refuse to work. You drain Mason's salary on designer clothes while your kids sleep in cramped beds. You want a big house? Go get a job." Mason looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He couldn't make eye contact with anyone, surrounded by dozens of angry, judgmental relatives who knew exactly what kind of coward he was. He totally, completely shrunk. He grabbed Chloe by the arm, hauled her to her feet, and practically dragged her out the front door. My parents followed them, heads bowed in absolute disgrace. We locked the door behind them, turned the Christmas music back on, and had the best holiday of my life. Fast forward a few months. Spring had arrived and I was thriving. I thought the drama was finally, permanently over. But I was drastically underestimating the destructive power of Chloe's toxic entitlement. Out of the blue, my parents sent me a desperate text message, begging for a meeting in a public place. They promised it wasn't about the house. Out of morbid curiosity, I agreed to meet them at a local Olive Garden. When I arrived, my parents and Mason were sitting in a booth. Mason looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a deeply wrinkled shirt. They cut right to the chase. Mason's credit was completely destroyed. Chloe had maxed out every single credit card in his name, plunging them into massive, suffocating debt. They were desperate to move out of my parents' house, but no landlord would rent to them. They begged me to co-sign a lease for a luxury apartment and to give them a large sum of cash to cover the security deposit and first month's rent. I actually laughed out loud right there in the restaurant. I grabbed a breadstick, took a bite, and looked at them. Let me get this straight. You try to steal my house, and when that fails, you want me to hand over my hard-earned salary to fund Chloe's lifestyle? Absolutely not. I am not your personal ATM. You made this bed, Mason. Sleep in it. Mason slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. You have so much money. You don't have a family. You're hoarding wealth while my kids suffer. You owe me. I owe you nothing, I said, standing up from the booth. I built my life from a freezing camper while you laughed at me. Good luck with your debt. I dropped a $10 bill on the table for my drink and walked out, leaving them speechless. But my refusal to fund their lifestyle triggered a catastrophic chain of events that ended up destroying their marriage entirely. Because Chloe couldn't get the luxury apartment she felt entitled to, she unleashed a wave of absolute fury on Mason. She constantly berated him, calling him a pathetic failure who wasn't man enough to provide for her. The tension in my parents' house reached a boiling point. And then Mason woke up. Maybe it was the stress, maybe it was the constant verbal abuse, or maybe he finally noticed what everyone else had suspected for months. Mason's youngest child, the baby Chloe had been pregnant with when she tried to steal my house, didn't look a thing like him. Mason and I both have dark, straight hair and dark eyes. The baby had light, curly hair and green eyes. Without telling anyone, Mason secretly swabbed the baby's cheek and sent it off for a DNA test. When the results came back, the entire family structure completely detonated. Mason was not the father. He confronted Chloe in the living room of my parents' house, waving the lab results in her face. Chloe panicked. She tried to deny it, tried to gaslight him, tried to claim the lab made a mistake. But Mason had already dug through her phone records and found months of text messages between Chloe and a man named Luke, a guy she had met at a bar while Mason was working overtime. When cornered with undeniable proof of her cheating, Chloe completely lost her mind. She turned violently physically abusive. She screamed, grabbed a heavy glass vase, and smashed it against the wall. When Mason tried to stop her, she lunged at him, scratching his face with her long acrylic nails, leaving deep, bloody gouges down his cheek. My father tried to intervene, and she punched him in the jaw. In the chaotic crossfire, Mason's oldest son, 8-year-old Isaac, got pushed hard against a doorframe, ending up with a bruised eye and a bloody nose. My mother called 911. The police arrived, saw the blood on Mason's face and the crying child, and immediately arrested Chloe. They slapped handcuffs on her wrists and dragged her out of the house screaming. Chloe's parents had to bail her out of jail 2 days later. And do you know what her very first move was after getting out? She drove straight to my house. I answered the door to find Chloe standing on my porch, looking completely unhinged. Her hair was a mess, her eyes were wild, and she reeked of stale alcohol. She pointed a shaking finger at my chest and started screaming that I was the reason her life was ruined. If you had just given us this house, none of this would have happened, she shrieked hysterically. Supporting the family was the least you could have done. If you weren't such a greedy pig, my family would still be together. I stared at her, utterly disgusted by her delusional reality. You cheated on your husband, Chloe, I said coldly. You got pregnant by another man. You racked up massive debt. You assaulted your husband and your child. And you are standing here blaming me? She raised her hand, curling her fingers into claws, preparing to strike me again. Step off my property, I commanded, pointing directly at the camera above her head. I am recording. If you touch me, I will make sure the judge sees it at your criminal trial. She froze, her eyes darting to the camera. The fight completely drained out of her. She turned around, got into her car, and sped away. The very next morning, I went to the courthouse with the video footage and easily secured a strict restraining order against her. The divorce was an absolute bloodbath. Because we live in an at-fault state, and because Mason had undeniable proof of her infidelity, financial ruin, and physical abuse, Chloe was completely destroyed in court. Mason hired a ruthless lawyer. Chloe actually brought her affair partner, Luke, to court, thinking he would support her. But when the judge informed Luke that he would be financially responsible for child support for the baby, the coward completely panicked. Luke dumped Chloe right there in the courthouse hallway, telling her he wasn't ready to be a father and abandoning her with a mountain of legal fees. Chloe lost primary custody of her 3 older children. She was ordered to pay back the majority of the credit card debt she had accrued. Without a penny of alimony and completely cut off from Mason's salary, she was forced to move back into her childhood bedroom at her parents' house and take a humiliating minimum-wage job working the cash register at her parents' small business. The Queen had officially lost her crown. The aftermath of the divorce left Mason a completely broken man. The betrayal destroyed his ego. One rainy Tuesday night, about a month after Chloe was kicked out, I heard a knock at my door. I opened it to find Mason standing in the rain. He looked terrible. He was clutching a bottle of cheap whiskey, and he had been crying. He didn't demand anything. He didn't act entitled. He just looked at me and completely broke down. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, his shoulders shaking. "I'm so sorry, Elijah. You were right about her. You were right about everything. I've been a terrible brother. I let her turn me into a monster. I didn't hug him. We weren't there yet. But I didn't shut the door in his face either. I brought him inside, made him a cup of black coffee, and let him talk. He confessed that his oldest son, Isaac, was traumatized by the fighting and desperately needed his own bedroom to feel safe. But they were still crammed into my parents' house. Mason looked at his shoes. "Elijah, I know I have absolutely no right to ask you for anything, but I need to put my kids first. Could I borrow the camper? I want to haul it to Mom and Dad's backyard and live in it. I want to give Isaac my bedroom in the house so he has his own space. I'll pay for any damages. I promise." The sheer, bitter irony of the situation hit me like a freight train. The brother who had laughed at me for living in a camper, who had called me a homeless bum, was now sitting at my kitchen table, begging to live in that exact same fiberglass box because his life had completely fallen apart. I looked at him for a long time. I thought about the freezing nights I spent in that camper. I thought about the blazing hot summers. And then I thought about 8-year-old Isaac, who didn't deserve any of this chaos. "I'll help you hitch it up tomorrow," I said quietly. A few days later, I drove my truck over to my parents' house and backed the camper into their yard. My father installed a dedicated power breaker for it. Mason moved his clothes into the camper, and little Isaac finally got his own room. The shock of the entire ordeal seemed to finally wake my parents up from their decades-long delusion. The public humiliation of the divorce, combined with the brutal reality check from the extended family, broke their narcissistic bubble. They started attending a local church. They enrolled in intensive family therapy. A few months later, they came to my house, sat on my couch, and delivered a genuine, tearful apology for how they had treated me my entire life. They admitted they had failed me. They admitted they had created the monster that Mason became. I told them that forgiveness takes time, and that words mean nothing without actions. But for the first time in my life, I felt like the heavy, suffocating chain tying me to my childhood trauma had finally been cut. I found a new rhythm in life. Without Chloe's toxic influence poisoning the family dynamic, Mason's kids became totally different people. They warmed up to me. I started attending their school plays and soccer games. I finally got to experience the joy of simply being a good uncle. There was one last petty incident. Early Halloween morning, I woke up to find my old pickup truck completely covered in smashed eggs. I checked my security cameras and saw a figure dressed in heavy sweatpants, a hoodie pulled tight, and giant sunglasses, sprinting away from my driveway at 3 a.m. It was incredibly obvious it was Chloe, driving all the way from her parents' house just to throw a petty tantrum. I didn't call the cops. I didn't file a report. I just grabbed a bucket of soapy water, went outside in the morning sun, and washed my truck. I actually smiled while I scrubbed the egg yolks off the windshield, because as I looked up at my beautiful 3-bedroom house and felt the warm sun on my face, I realized something incredibly profound. Chloe was sitting in a tiny childhood bedroom, drowning in debt, working a minimum wage job, and sneaking around in the middle of the night to throw eggs at a truck. She had nothing. I had my home. I had my peace. I had my future. I had fought through the absolute darkest, coldest nights of my life, and I had built an unshakable fortress with my own 2 hands. They tried to break me. They tried to take everything I earned. But in the end, the truth dragged them into the light, and I was the one left standing. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It wasn't an easy journey to recount, but I truly believe that sharing our darkest moments is how we find our strength. I hope this resonated with you in some way, and maybe gives you the courage to stand up to the toxic people in your own life. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, dealing with an entitled family member? Tell me about it down below. Before you go, I have a special request. If you made it all the way to this exact moment, you are part of a very special group. I want you to go into the comments and type the letter W. W stands for winner. It's our secret code, a sign for the 1% Club, the amazing, dedicated listeners who stay until the very last second. When I see that W, I'll know exactly who my true supporters are. Please don't forget to hit that like button and follow the channel so we can stay connected. I have a lot more stories to share, and I want you to be a part of them. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.